It's April 1945. The world, which had once cowered and trembled before the juggernaut of Hitler's armies, was now witnessing the precipitous, dramatic collapse of his dark dominion. The man who had once mesmerized millions on the grandest stages of Europe, promising an unthinkable 1,000-year Reich, was now a phantom figure, reduced to a quivering wreck, desperately clinging to life in the dank, concrete confines of his subterranean lair beneath the pulverized ruins of Berlin. For far too long, Adolf Hitler had meticulously woven and propagated a grotesque myth of his own invincible destiny. Every crushing defeat, every strategic blunder, he had fanatically dismissed as nothing more than transient setbacks. "The Führer's will is unbreakable," his relentless propaganda machine had bellowed, echoing through every radio and newspaper across Germany. Yet, in the chilling, suffocating reality of that underground tomb, his will was not merely broken. It was utterly, irrecoverably shattered. Above ground, Berlin, once the vibrant heart of the Third Reich, was transformed into a raging, apocalyptic inferno. The relentless tide of the Red Army, fueled by years of unimaginable suffering and a burning thirst for vengeance, was now just a few short, brutal miles away. The constant, thunderous roar of their artillery shells provided a terrifying, rhythmic pulse to the dying city, a drumbeat of doom. Inside the labyrinthine corridors of the Führer bunker, no comforting ray of sunlight ever penetrated. There was only the sickly, flickering glow of failing electric lamps, the acrid, stale stench of cigarette smoke, and the heavy, palpable reek of utter despair and paralyzing fear. Maps, brittle and yellowed with age, still clung to the concrete walls, haphazardly covered in frantic, delusional red arrows, charting imaginary counterattacks that could never materialize. Hitler, a mere wraith of his former bombastic self, clung with fanatical stubbornness to his underground sanctuary, refusing to contemplate escape. His most loyal generals, their faces etched with the profound exhaustion and desperation of a lost cause, implored him, begged him, to flee to the relative safety of the Bavarian Alps, to regroup, to somehow fight another day. But Hitler merely met their pleas with a chilling, derisive laugh. "Surrender? Never!" he rasped, his voice raw. "I will not run like a coward." To his warped mind, retreat was the ultimate, unforgivable humiliation, a fate infinitely worse than death itself. Yet, behind those once piercing, now vacant blue eyes, a profound and terrible transformation had taken place. For the very first time in his tyrannical, deluded existence, Adolf Hitler began to truly grasp the terrifying, ineluctable truth. His meticulously constructed world, his monstrous, fabricated empire, his absolute, unchallenged control, his very myth of unassailable invincibility. It was all irrevocably, irretrievably gone. The first deep crack in his impenetrable delusion appeared when Hermann Göring, his once unquestioningly loyal deputy and chosen successor, sent a message. Göring, with a rare flash of pragmatic realism, recognized the imminent, inevitable encirclement of Berlin, and logically suggested that he should assume command of Germany if Hitler became isolated. To any sane, rational leader facing utter annihilation, it would have been a practical, if desperate, contingency plan. To Hitler, however, it was the ultimate, unforgivable act of betrayal. He exploded in a terrifying, convulsive paroxysm of rage, his voice hoarse as he branded Göring a traitor and immediately issued an order for his arrest. But deep down, a chilling, insidious realization began to gnaw at him. Even his most inner circle, the sycophants who had fed his ego for years, had finally ceased to believe in a miraculous, impossible victory. By this point, every major city across the vast expanse of Germany lay in smoldering, pulverized ruins. The relentless advance of the Western Allies was pressing in from the west, while the unstoppable Soviet juggernaut thundered ever closer from the east. The once invincible Third Reich was utterly surrounded, its people starving, its territory carved up, its infrastructure collapsing, its very existence evaporating. Still, Hitler clung with a desperate, pathetic tenacity to the most fantastical of illusions. He convinced himself, against all logic and evidence, that the so-called Steiner counterattack, a desperate, last-ditch offensive supposedly led by General Felix Steiner, would somehow, miraculously, crush the Soviets and save Berlin from its fiery doom. Yet Steiner, who lacked both the necessary troops and any semblance of logistical support, never launched the attack. It was an utterly impossible order, a figment born purely from the Führer's deranged, collapsing fantasy world. When his staff, their faces ashen with fear and exhaustion, finally mustered the courage to inform him that Steiner's phantom forces had failed to move, something profound and terrible inside Hitler snapped. Witnesses later recounted, in hushed, terrified tones, how he began to shake uncontrollably, his fists slamming repeatedly against the table, his voice raw and broken as he screamed that the war was irrevocably lost and that everyone, absolutely everyone, had betrayed him. This was the infamous bunker meltdown, a terrifying, unforgettable spectacle of a dictator's final, public descent into madness, a moment that even his most devoted officers would carry to their graves. It was the precise moment, the illusion, the meticulously crafted facade of invincibility shattered completely, exposing the terrified, broken man beneath. For the very first time, Hitler uttered the words his men never, in their wildest nightmares, thought they would hear. The war is lost. He then abruptly and violently dismissed everyone from the suffocating room. When they cautiously returned, minutes or perhaps an eternity later, his voice was unnervingly quieter, devoid of its usual bombast, his face pale, utterly drained, almost spectral in the dim light. He no longer spoke of impossible victory or a glorious destiny or the eternal glory of the Reich. He spoke only of death. He chillingly informed them that he would remain in Berlin and take his own life when the time came, dictating the terms of his final exit. The man who had once commanded millions with a single imperious order now sat slumped, a pathetic figure trembling in the shadows, his gaze fixed blankly on the concrete floor. Even the air in the bunker seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if everyone present could feel the immense, suffocating weight of history irrevocably closing in, sealing their fate. Outside, the brutal, relentless symphony of battle intensified with every passing minute, every second. The grinding rumble of Soviet tanks, the incessant, earth-shaking pounding of artillery. The Red Army had already breached the city center, a vanguard of vengeance. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a hellish, roaring landscape of fire, choked with noxious smoke and the dust of pulverized buildings, as terrified civilians desperately fled through mountains of rubble. SS officers frantically, desperately burned incriminating documents, their faces grim, while mere boys, some too young to even shave, were cruelly thrust into ill-fitting uniforms and sent to defend streets that, in any meaningful sense, no longer existed. Hitler's world, a monstrous edifice built on fear, lies, and brutal, unfeeling iron will, was dissolving faster than his deluded, collapsing mind could possibly comprehend. But he wasn't just losing a war, he was losing his very identity, the godlike, infallible image he had painstakingly constructed and nurtured in his own twisted mind for decades. For years, his pervasive, insidious propaganda had hammered home the message that he was chosen by fate, a divinely appointed leader. Now, as the very walls of the bunker shuddered and groaned with each concussive explosion, even he began to wonder, with a chilling dread, if fate had utterly, irrevocably abandoned him. In a quiet, overlooked corner of his desk, he kept a small, cherished portrait of Frederick the Great, the legendary Prussian king who, centuries earlier, had famously snatched victory from the very jaws of near defeat. Hitler stared at it often, his eyes searching, desperate, as if waiting for a miracle, a divine intervention that would never, ever arrive. By mid-April, the grim, unceasing reports flooded into the bunker, each one a fresh, agonizing dagger to his fading hope. His closest allies were either gone, dead, or actively betraying him. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and head of the dreaded SS, was secretly attempting to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, a betrayal of monumental proportions. Joseph Goebbels, his chief propagandist and sycophant, was visibly breaking down emotionally, his own sanity crumbling under the weight of the impending doom. Hitler's once powerful generals were either dead on distant battlefields, captured by the advancing enemy, or desperately fleeing the collapsing front, seeking any escape from the inferno. The man who had once commanded millions with an unquestioned authority now ruled over a mere handful of terrified staff and secretaries, trapped underground in a self-made tomb, a prisoner of his own making. Then came the final crushing blow, a thunderbolt of inescapable reality. News reached the bunker that Soviet troops were now within blocks, mere meters, of the Reich Chancellery itself. The thunderous roar of artillery echoed through the endless night, no longer a distant threat, but an immediate, terrifying presence vibrating through the very earth. The end was no longer a vague rumor, a hypothetical outcome. It was the unmistakable, terrifying sound of countless footsteps above him, closing in, sealing his fate. He knew then, with a chilling, undeniable certainty, that there would be no escape, no impossible victory, no shred of redemption, only an ending, absolute and final. But the precise, agonizing moment he truly realized it was irrevocably over wasn't during a heated, desperate meeting or a frantic battlefield report. It happened in profound, terrifying silence. It was when he walked into his private quarters, slowly, deliberately closed the heavy, insulated door behind him, and looked into the mirror. He saw not the Führer, not the conquering hero of Europe, not the architect of a new world order, but an old, broken man, his face pale and drawn, deeply etched with the lines of stress and madness, his hands trembling uncontrollably, his eyes no longer blazing with furious ambition, but filled with a chilling, soul-crushing emptiness. Adolf Hitler, the man who had once promised a dystopian paradise, now resembled nothing more than the spectral ghost of his own monstrous creation. He knew the end was imminent, unavoidable, but even in this final, desperate hour, he sought to choreograph it, to control his last, pathetic moment as he had once controlled nations, controlled millions of lives. If he couldn't win the war, he would at least dictate how it ended, preserving a shred of his twisted dignity. He issued precise, chilling orders to his dwindling staff to burn all records that might in any way humiliate him, to erase any trace of his weaknesses. He meticulously gave instructions that his body be utterly destroyed after death, reduced to unrecognizable ash. He harbored a profound visceral fear of being displayed, desecrated, Like Benito Mussolini, his body hung upside down in a public square for the world to see and mock, a final abject humiliation. Even in his final gasping hours, vanity, that insidious, pervasive master, ruled him more profoundly than any flicker of humanity, any shred of decency. Outside, the Red Army was savagely storming Berlin, street by blood-soaked street, building by burning building. The once proud, majestic German capital had been utterly transformed into a desolate, moon-like wasteland. Buildings were gutted, their skeletal remains reaching to a sky perpetually blackened by smoke, ash, and the dust of destruction. The incessant roar of tanks, the chilling clatter of machine guns, and the terrifying hiss of flamethrowers echoed through the ruins, a constant, deafening reminder of the inferno raging above. Hitler could hear it all, every explosion, every scream, every dying gasp feeling like another agonizing heartbeat of his crumbling empire. Inside the bunker, food supplies were nearly exhausted, a mere trickle remaining. There was no more water pressure in many sections of the vast complex, and electricity flickered erratically, failing completely in parts of the sprawling subterranean labyrinth, plunging rooms into Stygian darkness. Secretaries wept quietly, ceaselessly, through the long, terrifying nights, their hopes long extinguished. Some, gripped by paralyzing fear of capture and the inevitable retribution, had already taken their own lives with cyanide capsules. Even his beloved German shepherd, Blondie, had tragically become a part of his morbid final delusion. He tested the poison on her to ensure its efficacy, a grotesque act of depravity. That was the kind of man he had become, a ruler so utterly consumed by fear, paranoia, and megalomania that he trusted death more implicitly than loyalty, even the unconditional loyalty of his own pet. By April 29th, the crackling radio brought him the ultimate, final humiliation, a death knell of his fascist alliance. Benito Mussolini, his closest ideological ally, his grotesque, sycophantic mirror in Italy, had been captured, executed by his own people, and his body, grotesquely mutilated, was then publicly displayed, hung upside down in Piazzale Loreto for all the world to see and scorn. Hitler stared at the report for a long, silent, horrifying time. He said nothing, his face a mask of utter despair. Then, in a voice that barely carried through the suffocating air, a voice devoid of its former power, he muttered, "I will not suffer Mussolini's fate." That was the chilling, resolute moment he finally accepted death, not as a defeat, but as his last desperate act of control, his ultimate assertion of will. He would decide when the Third Reich ended, and how. That very night, in a bizarre, macabre ceremony, he married Eva Braun, his longtime mistress and loyal companion. It was not a wedding born of love or joy, but a chilling, theatrical ritual, a final, fragile illusion of normalcy performed against the backdrop of utter, apocalyptic collapse. They toasted with cheap champagne, the flimsy glasses rattling as artillery shells shook the very foundations of the bunker, the world ending above them. Witnesses described him as strangely calm, almost unnervingly polite, distant even, gentle. It was as if the furious, destructive storm that had raged within him for so long had finally, eerily, gone silent, replaced by a profound, terrifying emptiness. But outside that small, candle-lit room, everything was already unequivocally over. The Red Army had breached the very gates of the government district. Gunfire echoed ominously, ceaselessly, above. Soldiers of the Reich, starving, broken, and utterly demoralized, were surrendering in droves or dying in the burning streets, their sacrifice meaningless. There was no army left to save him, no impregnable fortress left to defend him, just a crumbling bunker beneath a city that, in any recognizable form, no longer existed. When his distraught aides cautiously entered the room on the afternoon of April 30th, they found him slumped lifelessly on the couch, a Walther PPK pistol still clutched in his hand. Eva Braun lay beside him, a faint, bitter, almond-like smell of cyanide hanging heavy in the air. The man who had demanded that millions die for his insane vision, for his monstrous ambition, could not, in the end, face defeat himself. His loyal guards, fulfilling his final macabre wish, carried the bodies upstairs to the Chancellery Garden and burned them under the gray, ash-laden Berlin sky, just as he had meticulously ordered. Above them, Soviet shells continued to fall, a final, thunderous funeral dirge for a fallen empire, for a monstrous ideology. The vast, dark regime that had once stretched its malevolent shadow from the Atlantic to the Volga ended not in glory, but in a few feet of smoldering, unrecognizable ash. When Soviet troops finally discovered the bunker complex days later, a scene of utter decay and desperation greeted them. Maps scattered across tables, half-eaten food moldering, and desperate, frantic notes scribbled on the concrete walls by those who had been trapped within its suffocating embrace. Everything reeked of smoke, sweat, and profound, lingering fear. In the very room where Hitler had died, the air was still heavy, thick with unspoken horrors, a tangible presence, as if history itself refused to move on from that terrible, defining moment. His remaining guards surrendered soon after. Berlin, the once proud capital, fell completely on May 2nd. Within a week, Nazi Germany, the so-called Thousand-Year Reich, was utterly extinguished, its reign of terror over. It had lasted barely 12 years, but the story, in the collective consciousness of a traumatized world, did not simply end there. In the tumultuous, disorienting months that followed, wild rumors spread like wildfire across Europe and beyond, that Hitler had miraculously escaped, that he was alive somewhere, perhaps hiding in the remote jungles of South America. For many Germans, shattered by the horrific truth and grappling with the moral abyss of their nation's actions, it was far easier, far more comforting, to cling to such desperate fantasies than to face the brutal, soul-crushing reality that their Führer had utterly abandoned them, just as he had abandoned reality itself long before the final, cataclysmic end. Because the true moment Adolf Hitler lost the war wasn't in that claustrophobic, crumbling bunker. It wasn't when the Allied armies surged across the Rhine, a symbolic triumph, or when the Soviets finally seized Berlin, marking the physical end. It was years earlier, the insidious, fateful moment he convinced himself he was infallible, that destiny was his personal servant, that fate could never betray him. The bunker was merely the final gruesome stage where that catastrophic illusion, that monumental lie, finally, spectacularly died. As Berlin burned, and the echoes of war finally began to fade, millions of lives across Europe were left irrevocably shattered. Families were torn apart, entire cities erased from the map, generations scarred by unimaginable trauma, by the searing memory of genocide and total war. And for what? For the narcissistic delusion of a single evil man who thought himself greater than truth, greater than humanity itself, capable of bending reality to his will. In the end, history does not remember Hitler for his short-lived empire, for his mesmerizing, hate-filled speeches, or for his temporary, brutal conquests. It remembers the profound, echoing silence that followed, the silence of a city utterly reduced to ruins, the suffocating silence of a bunker deep underground, a tomb of shattered dreams, and the chilling silence of a man who, in his final terrifying moments, finally, belatedly, realized that the world he had built from hate, fear, and lies could never, would never outlive him. The Third Reich, the monstrous regime of terror, didn't end with a grand, glorious battle or a heroic, defiant last stand. It ended with a single, muffled gunshot echoing through the darkness, a pathetic, ignominious sound marking the definitive fall of a dictator who, in his boundless arrogance, believed he could rewrite fate itself. And in that terrifying, yet profoundly significant moment, the world collectively exhaled, not in triumph, but in a weary, silent relief, because the nightmare, at long last, was truly over.